We've known Craig for about 30 years or more, though he has experience of more than that, of course. And he accumulated this over years of work with the forest and wildlife conservation. He began the Sierra Forest Protection Campaign in about 1996. And we came along as became part of that in 1997 or so, after working on things in our own community. I live in Grass Valley, California, and we have any number of issues, have had over the years in conservation. And Craig and Sierra Forest Protection Campaign has helped tremendously. He also then, after Sniff Pick, as we called it, became the Sierra Forest Legacy. And some of you are maybe more familiar with it. It's had a fabulous website and still has a website for that matter. But Craig moved on in later in 2019 into fire restoration work, which he has been very, very active in and has written papers on it. And I hope he'll tell you about that. I'm less familiar with it. So I want to welcome Craig, and he's got a lot to say, and I don't want to take up any more time.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the invite. And I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to do Q&A until we all fall asleep if we need to make sure we get to your questions. So this conversation is centered around ecological reforestation. And that in itself implies a certain position that I hold, that there are certainly areas of this landscape that are in need of reforestation based on the generally uncharacteristic fire responses we're seeing in California. And I'm sure you will all understand, but I want everyone to know I'm going to be a little critical of the Forest Service now and then. But the Forest Service represents the broader range of values of the American citizenry. So there's people that think a whole lot like us and people that really don't think anything close to like us about what natural resource management ought to be and what our landscapes are for and not for. So, like right now, I have 4 Forest Service former employees that work with me, and they're as green as grass. And so, there's this issue of, I will call out some of the most misguided management directions in the history of human existence done by this agency, which one would be old growth logging, serial logging of old growth for over a century, travesty. The other would be fire exclusion and excessive fire suppression in a strongly fire-associated landscape. Huge mistake. But the third pillar of this misguided decision-making is what we're going to talk about today, and that's ecological reforestation, which is planting with your ecological brains and intentions and not just with your tape measure. So we're going to chat a little bit about that. I have a few slides, and then we can go into some questions. The reason I started to get involved in this is I kept seeing over and over and over again for way too many years landscapes planted back like they were croplands, or like I'm a small scale organic farmer. So like when you plant corn, so they were planting trees without really thinking about the ecosystem they lived in. And they were planting at densities that appeared to me to be burning up as fast as they could get them in the ground. And so in a couple of years back, Malcolm North and Mark Meyer, who's the zone ecologist in the Southern Sierra, and Malcolm North is a PSW researcher that's been around a long time, started working on this ecological reforestation effort. And what you see there is just a picture of the first page of a sample 4-page design pattern that's Karen has got linked for anyone who wants to go a little bit deeper. So the general theme is this individual trees, clumps, and openings, the ICO pattern of a restored fire regime in Yosemite is, I'm not saying that we need to make everything look like this picture, but what it is a sample design of an idea that shows up in nature regularly in a frequent fire system. And it's way less uniform and therefore much more fire resilient than if you plant wall-to-wall trees on 12-foot centers by the hundreds. And so that's what we were seeing, and it's getting harder and harder to justify. So the theme here is heterogeneity, patchiness. Heterogeneity equals resilience. Heterogeneity equals resistance, and the next slide is uniformity. Not so much. And this is, there was a paper before this by Malcolm North called Reforestation for Resilience that was very interesting and was talking about design patterns that we'll be getting into here today. But this paper really knocked me over when I read it. And it's from a graduate student of Scott Stevens in his fire lab, Jacob Levine. But it's got Scott on the paper, highly thought of fire ecologist, professor at UC Berkeley and good friend. Brandon Collins is currently the head of the ecological program shop at whatever's left of the Forest Service in California. He's in charge of that ecological shop and those zone ecologists. So these aren't lightweights. And they did a very rigorous study in 2022, and all it looked at, so this is only one of the variables that we all need to think about when we're thinking about fire behavior. But one of the key variables they looked at was land ownership. And the question was, gee, does private industrial timberlands have a different fire pattern or fire severity than Forest Service ground? And other, like the landscape I live on. And the question was a shockingly yes. Industrial timberlands, 154 wildfires burned a combined area of 971,000 hectares. That's 2.5 million acres, 2.3 million acres, with a much higher odds of high severity fire on industrial timberlands. 1.8 times greater. So the interesting part of this conclusion is that overall the results indicate prevailing forest management practices on private industrial timberlands may increase high severity fire occurrence. So the reason that they are calling this out, and you'd have to get into the paper, which is it's linked in one of the other offerings that we've got attached to the invite. It's when you get deeper into the paper, it calls out plantation, forestry, and uniformity as the reason for this significantly higher wildfire severity. And while it does point to the industrial lands, there's a bigger conversation than that. And so we're going to get into that a little bit, but there's a link to the paper there, but there's also something that Karen's going to send out if you want to go deeper. And even if you don't read the papers and all the geeky details, look at the abstract because they will knock you over. There was a presentation a few years later by roughly the same group of authors that says, yeah, uniformity is not a great thing for wildfire resilience. And when the weather's really bad, in other words, when the wind's blowing, then it's really, really bad. So, it's kind of like, duh. But, we have this high-powered group of people calling out a practice that we are implementing in the name of reforestation that's recreating the conditions that are in a fair amount responsible for burning up the state of California. The claim that we want to mitigate that wildfire severity, and yet we're planting trees back that contributes to it greatly. So anyway, next slide, Karen. So I started looking at fire behavior fairly seriously way back in 1992. And I was reading a chapter in a Ecology technical report. There was a chapter by a group of fire scientists, and they called out the El Dorado National Forest fire return interval for that whole 670,000 acre landscape of 29,000 acres a year. That was fairly shocking to me back 34 years ago. And my first fire that I paid any attention to was the Cleveland fire in 1992. It was a supposedly accidental human ignition. It burned Michigan, California, and Forest Service plantations. It was 24,580 acres. It was in massive uniformity. And then what happened afterwards was even more shocking to me, since I live right adjacent to this landscape. We had the St. Pauli fire in 2002. We had the Fred's fire in 2004. We had the King fire in 2014. What do you notice about those three pictures? Very even-aged uniformity. That is an ecological condition of that scale, does not exist in our frequent fire system. That has nothing to do with nature and what nature would do under a normal fire regime. That we did that. And we planted trees like it was cropland. And we burned them up every time. And it keeps happening. So that 24,000 acre fire now doesn't even register, right? That's not even anywhere, if it's not burning hundreds of thousands of acres, we don't even pay attention anymore. But back then, I thought that was the end of the world. This is to demonstrate the other big point. It's not just industrial timberland that's causing these large-scale fire events. It's also Smokey Bear and our public land management decisions. So this is a 75-year history of fires inside the rim fire footprint on the Stanislaus National Forest. So Yosemite is to the right, basically, of this photo. And those different colors are different fires. The red squiggly line that goes around them is the rim fire footprint. And that was, over a decade ago. And so this 75 years of putting uniformity back on the ground and then burning it up over and over and over and over. And the Stanislaus complex was the last one that was the last big fire that burned there. And the rim fire then burned through all of that regrowth that was planted once again on 12-foot centers like it's corn. So next slide. So this is an article from the Forest Service's Reforestation website, and it's called Growing Hope. And this is talking about, and I'm not disparaging the hard work that went into planting 493,000 trees on 1,500 acres. Not disparaging the hard work. It was the wrong thing to do, but it was a lot of hard work. So that's 328 trees per acre, a fairly startlingly high, unheard of high number of trees per acre. And look at that little seedling that you just hold up, and then look behind it. And that whole rimfire landscape looks like a moonscape from being burned over and over and over. And then we put uniformity back in there and wall-to-wall trees, and then we burn it up again. That's what kind of got us going over here in the ecology sector, was working with researchers and zoning ecologists and some NGO partners and saying, okay, this is nuts. We've got to start applying our ecological brains to how we put trees back in the ground where we feel that we need to. And we can talk about where that might be and where it doesn't need to be in a minute. But 493,000 trees on 1,500 acres. Next slide. By the way, when I confronted the supervisor, Jason Kuiken, about the insanity of doing that level of density, his answer was, well, Craig, it was decided by a collaborative. So I guess the takeaway from that is if a group of people get together and make a bad decision, it's somehow okay. No, it's not. So what to do about this? And this is kind of the work realm now of understand the landscape we live in, which is one of the most naturally fire-associated landscapes on planet Earth. When you look at the research on what I just said, you'll see there's a really good paper around 2000 by Herrera and others, and it's got Hugh Safford and Scott Stevens on the paper. So we've got knowledgeable people from the United States engaging with people all over the world. And when you look at the Mediterranean climates on the planet, places like Portugal and Spain, Australia, Western Chile, parts of South Africa, those are the places that you see a lot of fire happening. Well, California leads the league. And for several reasons, but one reason is we're the only landscape that's a Mediterranean climate that's fire associated, that has 40 million people running around. And when my work partner and I, Brent, did a study using the Forest Service's wildfire human ignitions data, we found some very interesting statistics about why we have so much fire in California. Besides lightning, is that one is machines, equipment, tools, power lines, all this stuff associated with our technology is a major source of ignitions. The other one is campfire escapes. Evidently, we don't know how to put a campfire out. So I'm being a little snarky here, but that's because when I look at what the problem is, it tends to look a lot like us figuring out how to live here appropriately. And we've got some learning to do when it comes to how to live with fire. But we do have roughly 40 million people running around. So, how do we think about fire in terms of resilience? How do we think about patterning in terms of resilience? So we've been working on reforesting areas using our ecological brains and not just our tape measures, and to understand what reforestation for resilience actually looks like. When you see folks out in the woods with a tree bag, they're either stepping off or using their tape measure to tell them, generally, not everywhere, but generally where to plant that tree. They've got a quota, they've got a spacing recommendation, which is usually 12 feet on center, and that's what they get paid to do. And we're saying, nah, let's train up people to be more thoughtfully ecologically and to think about the common things, slope and aspect to where it's drier, where it's wetter, but also basins that might hold more water, for example, versus really thin soils on a high, steep slope. Where is the place where we want to concentrate reforestation? And it's generally and recommended in these general technical reports. My next statement there, post-fire restoration framework, those two GTRs ought to be in everybody's library. They're available online, and they're some of the best work that's been done in a long time. And they definitely call out that when you're in a mixed severity situation in California, particularly in the Sierra Nevada, that's not a place to think about reforestation. You generally get adequate reforestation because there's enough living green trees left. But what we're seeing, like in the Caldor fire just up the hill from where I live, they want to go right into the 50% mortality areas and fill it full of their own trees. And that's not a place to go when we're short on staff, short on trees, and short on time. If we do want to do reforestation, 50% severity is what this system evolved with. It didn't evolve with a lot of high severity. So the choices about where we go matters. Educating via post-fire restoration framework GTRs is it's great to have around. It's great to have around for a reference. It's great to have around for teaching and training. And then engaging partners in collaborative stewardship to foster resilience without toxic chemicals. I don't know if you've seen the Mother Jones glyphosate article yet, but I strongly encourage you to Google it if you haven't. And the thing that we generally see on our current Forest Service landscapes is plant, spray, and pray. They oftentimes don't go back in too much stewardship at all. They're heavily addicted to chemical use. And what we need is people getting involved and not the chemicals, and doing the stewardship work on the landscapes that we care about, where we do replant. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the nonsense you will hear and how to push back from it. So these are things that I run into all the time. This is what the Forest Service tries to throw up to defend themselves, which is amazing to me. Forest Service, my 36-year-old forest plan says I need to plant 300 trees per acre on 12-foot centers. A good response is, has your landscape changed at all in the last 36 years? Are you dealing with a different scale of problems? What about climate warming and drought intolerance and increased fire likelihood? Do any of those things suggest you might want to think about that 12-foot spacing? The second thing I hear regularly is the 1976 National Forest Management Statute requires that we assess appropriate forest cover. So this is a 50-year-old statute. And my answer to them is, show me the assessment. You're supposed to do it, show it to me, which they can't. Especially show me where it suggests that high-density plantation forestry is adapting to climate change and wildfire resilience. So this is old school nonsense from old school foresters. You don't hear this from ecologists. And then the final trigger point for this craziness is, okay, Craig, we give up. We'll try some of your experimental ideas and monitor them and let you know about the results. So this is, once again, manipulation. There's nothing, what my answer back to them is, no, wrong answer. Your time of 100 years of practicing high density plantation forestry and this idea about competitive exclusion, if you cram enough trees in, nothing else will be able to grow. That idea is over. That's the thing that needs to change, not the practice of a patchy distribution well tended, but the uniformity across thousands of acres needs to stop. Next slide. These are just some references that I've looked back on as some of the more thoughtful things that have been written. And I've mentioned them, the Reforestation for Resilience, the Levine 2022 paper, where we first saw the accumulation of industrial timberlands burning up California, and then the 2025 version, which is saying when the weather's bad, it's way worse. And then this Boasfield paper, 2025, looked at all of planet Earth, and in particular the Northern Hemisphere, called out industrial timberlands in China, Russia, Canada, USA, all a disaster. Uniformity does not work in a frequent fire system. And this last paper I just love, from Hugh Safford, brand new paper. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it is calling out the tragic deforestation, reforestation dilemma in a hotspot of fire-driven forest loss, and it's all about our state. California, and failing to learn lessons we should have learned a long time ago. What I found really interesting, and I brought this up when I spoke at the Board of Forestry meeting last week, was this paper, the Safford paper, which calls out uniformity as a very bad thing, was funded by a CAL FIRE Forest Health Research Agreement. So CAL FIRE paid for this study. And I brought that up as I was waving it around to the board and saying, calling them out and saying it is really time that we get together and figure out how to do this differently and be more thoughtful about it and take care of it once we do it. I will wrap it up there and happy to answer questions, and conversations are welcome.
And thank you, Craig, for an important talk. So yeah, we got a few questions from our dear friend Craig Patterson in Oregon. And I think your views on clearcutting were abundantly clear in your presentation. Craig wants to know that any tree planting projects like in the ideal world, I hope you meant this, Craig, if they're done properly, reintroducing biodiversity, et cetera, does that still perpetuate clearcutting?
Certainly not as much, but what perpetuates clearcutting is standards that allow it to happen. It has nothing to do with ecological integrity, which is a rule that supposedly guides Forest Service decision making. That's one of the things we're hammering them about, because ecological integrity does not support uniform high density plantation forestry. But I would argue that if you're planting trees like a cropland, then you're going to be cutting them down again. That's what you do. You plant them, you grow them up, and as soon as they get about this big and they stop expanding their base of their bowl, then, oh, they're done. We whack them and send them off to the mill and plant them again. So that circle of gloom and doom is, it's self-perpetuating. In the Forest Service, not in this current nightmare we're living in, but in other eras, the idea of ecological integrity and restoring old growth conditions as an important critical part of the landscape, restoring beneficial fire, and planting in patterns that resemble more like what the natural system would do are much better choices.
Okay, and I see that Craig has his hand raised.
Isn't tree planting the greatest justification for clearcutting? That's my question.
I think the demand for wood products and the rules that allow it are the thing that offers the clearcutting practice to be something acceptable, which for me, it's certainly not. But not replanting. Replanting the right way in a landscape that's had uncharacteristic fire, that's burned in uncharacteristic fuel loads, in uncharacteristically dense forests, trying to get back to something more ecologically sensible. It doesn't foster clearcutting, no.
Okay, Craig Patterson, I hope that met your needs in terms of answering your question. Okay, so our next questionnaire actually has multiple questions, and I tried to kind of synopsize what she's getting at, or he. And this questionnaire is concerned with integrating historic ecologies adapted to climate change into urban, peri-urban, and rural landscapes. So they emphasize the importance of community-led stewardship that integrates modern ecological restoration science with traditional ecologic knowledge. So the questions asked are, how can we best advance community-led land stewardship that combines modern ecological restoration science like variable density and beneficial fire with traditional ecological knowledge?
That is a very admirable goal, and that is something I try to do every day in my work. And it's working with prescribed burn associations. It's getting people used to fire in, WUI communities, the one I live in, so that they're not terrified about it. It's getting them to do their defensible space so they can worry less about it. But one of the most important things is to help people understand that the folks who lived here for 20,000 years at least had a very deep, deep relationship with fire. But they didn't run around all day with their head in their hands, terrified about fuel loading. That's a mess we've created. So adopting and supporting the sovereignty of tribal partners and breaking down the barriers so that they can work on their lands, but also across jurisdictions, and do so without chemicals is a very, very, very important pursuit for us all to work on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And same questioner, how can we ensure that local communities are active land stewards instead of just passive observers?
That's a good point. I've found that helping people understand and this is detailed and it's got variability to it, but I understand the fire regime and the landscapes they live in, particularly up here in the forested foothills where Barb and I live. The fire regime where I live is somewhere around 5 to 10 years. And when I give talks out in my local community, people are like, what? And I'm helping them understand, and I show photographs of recent fires in these landscapes and how we responded to them to get people to understand fire is, you need to do your defensible space. You need to get involved with your fire safe council. You need to respect tribal sovereignty and support their engagement. And we need to be doing things also around the communities, but also at the farther reaches of the landscape to reestablish ecological integrity. And a lot of that's done with fire. Some of it's done with thinning. None of it's done with clear cutting. But it's what we see in the Forest Service is how do we get more big trees on the log truck? Exactly the wrong thing to be doing. What we don't see enough of is people that can make small diameter wood products function, like a post or a pole. So we're treating the overstock conditions, not the rare, incredibly important overstory. In most cases, that to me it's all part of the landscape level conservation approach.
And finally, from the same questioner, what strategies can land trusts employ to prevent extraction activities that could jeopardize these efforts?
Oh boy. It's not easy to get to know people that have different points of view. I will argue that there is no black and white answer. That may trouble somebody, but I'm sorry. There's nothing but gray, and figuring out how to do the right work is incredibly important. There's a stunning level of money coming on the ground right now, Jennifer. Like I've worked in my community here, we've been working with over $6 million doing fuel break work. No trees bigger than 12 inches were touched. No hardwoods were touched. And we still have a reasonably decent fuel break on exactly the right location. So it's trust. And so far I've prevailed in no chemical herbicides. And we've got a good fire safe council that's promoting expanding beneficial fire. We have a really good prescribed burn association that's promoting that. All those pieces fit together.
Okay, well, all that you're saying, all that we're discussing here is prompting a whole lot more questions. So for folks out there, please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Otherwise, they're going to get missed. And we'll keep going. And Craig has generously agreed to stay over time to try to get to any questions, as many questions as we can. So if in the hour your question doesn't get asked, it's because there were so many. And if you're patient and you want to hang in there with you, we're going to try to get to all of them. Okay, so from Cynthia Denny, are you telling us that the U.S. Forest Service is always replanting our public lands in a plantation method the same way as many corporations are planting?
I'm hoping that's changing. It's right now the money stream comes in a certain way, and the reforestation staff people at what used to be our regional office are very old school. They are not supportive of more creative ideas of moving away from uniformity and planting in a more ecologically thoughtful way. They're very much tied to a vision of forcing nature to do what we want and planting trees like it's cropland. I want to say I've got a pin. We're moving away from it. It's too damn slow, but we're starting to break down the resistance to some degree. We've got folks like from American Forests that agree with us. They're struggling because they get a boatload of money coming downhill to do things a certain way. And we're trying to get them to say, let's plant this over here in a different way and not do it all in a uniform way. We actually had I can't attest to this outcome yet, but when I spoke at the Board of Forestry last week and I held up that paper I mentioned and waved it around, their response was, we're going to try the new ideas and we're going to have the meeting with all these authors and figure out what to do. So I'll tell you more when that happens. But right now we're funding a density that's the wrong thing to be doing on both the private sector and the public sector. And we're trying to manage that in a way that gets us someplace better.
Thank you so much. Craig, I think I met you about 15 years ago up in the Sierras, but what I wanted to ask in conjunction with the question you answered, has that always been true? Okay, so was it true back in the 1960s that they were planting that way?
Yeah.
Or when did they start planting that way? Because I
Well,
remember as a
yeah.
young woman being in the Michigan forest in the winter. Well, I don't really support the notion of snowmobiles, but I was on one, and I don't remember it looking at all like, like a commercially planted forest at all.
Well, you probably have a different fire regime there, so I can't really talk about that.
Oh.
Remember, if we were talking about Yellowstone National Park and lodgepole pine forests, an infrequent naturally stand replacing fire regime is what that place is.
So you're
That's not
saying
what
it's
we
planted
are.
in that way that you're describing that is not good. Is that correct?
What I'm saying is, depending on where you are, like in Yellowstone, I don't know if you remember back in the late 80s when the park manager said, no, we're not going to put this fire out. We're going to have it burn like it should. That was a stunning event. That was huge in terms of breaking the ground to be thinking about ecological process and not just control all the time. So I don't know that much about Michigan, but here, the whole problem started back around 1933, I think, and there was a paper put out by a couple of forest research folks called Dunning and Renicky. And that paper was about competitive exclusion and trying to take up all the space with trees when you plant so that no shrubs can grow, the sunlight and the water and the nutrients all get captured by the trees and nothing else is allowed in there. That's been the model, you guys. It's like, whew. So no concept, if you know the Forest Service's history from 1905, fire was the great evil. The critical, as critical as rainfall or biological decomposition or wind, fire is a critical ecological process. It's a central part of our state's central part of our state's ecosystem. Different fire regime, if we're talking chaparral in southern Sierra, that's a different thing. But up here, we have records of fire return intervals, and we have a deep level of knowledge about what the system is. And the system on its own creates heterogeneity and patchiness, and it creates resilience. That's why those large, old, fire-resilient, habitat-enhancing, carbon-storing old-growth trees matter so much, and why that was a travesty that they were a target for decades. And if you're wondering who I am, it's true that I own 4 chainsaws, and I built part of my house out of my own trees. Okay, here's a look at them. And I've also put my life on the line to stop the El Dorado National Forest from logging old growth in 1994. I had 2 years of death threats to my wife and my young daughter and me. We had 7 arson fires in August of 94 as a delinquent arsonist tried to burn my house down. He burned down 12 of my neighbors' homes. So don't think for 1 minute I don't fight for this stuff. I just don't believe in the zero cut thing. I think there's work to be done by the right people doing the right work. It has nothing to do with clear cutting. There's some thinning that should happen because we've created a naturally overstocked, dense mess that we've kept fire out of. So that's just a little sidebar on who I am.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. We're going to move on. Okay, so Carl, the Forest Service has said their plan in the Tahoe Basin allows for the use of herbicide treatment to aid site preparation before tree planting and to manage competing vegetation after planting. What exactly does site preparation before tree planting look like?
It can look like a nightmare of, bulldozers with 3-foot ripper teeth tearing in the ground to shreds, trying to get all the roots and stumps out if you're an industrial timberland owner. It can look at something much more benign, but it's the standard thing for site prep is the use of glyphosate. That's why it's really important to look at that Mother Jones article. And if you just Google Mother Jones and glyphosate, you'll get the article. And when you open the article, you can read, but the real thing to do is to get down to the YouTube video, which is 21 minutes. It is knocked the Forest Service on their heels because the science behind the use of that herbicide has been debunked and it's been pulled out of the research docket now. They have no scientific evidence to support the label claim that it's safe any longer. So we don't want that. We want the system managed by well-meaning people and by the work of hands and by the work of fire. And, we've done things where we've gone up into roadless areas. I was at this meeting up at Lake Tahoe I was telling some of you about, and it was like, I couldn't believe some of the things I was hearing. And we've done, with the Sierra Club on board, we've done good work in a roadless area by packing in equipment camping out, cutting small diameter trees. You can cut trees up to 12 inches. We all knew enough to know that it was overstocked understories. We cut them, we piled them with the Eldorado hot shots, and we burned those piles. We don't need log trucks and we don't need roads. But we need to make damn sure that we're doing the right work with people that know what that looks like.
Okay, and from Clinton Kellner, how did the California Board of Forestry react to you saying we need to do things differently?
Well, I'll tell you, I was floored that Terry O'Brien looked at me and said, we're going to do it. So I need to call him on it. You know, I've already reached out to all the authors on those papers in that reference slide. I've already reached out to all the authors I can get my hands on, Malcolm Norris, Scott Stevens, and Hugh Safford. And Jamie Liderson works for CAL FIRE's science arm. Wonderful person. She has spoken out in public meetings saying there's no ecological analog to high density plantation forestry. Said it in front of hundreds of people. So she's not a weakling at all. She's very strong. I said, we need those 4 people in the room, and anybody can bring anybody else they want, but we need to have a conversation about how we're going to do this differently and quit funding the thing we're trying to prevent.
Okay, and from Geneva, what are the prospects for reducing human-caused ignitions? People I talk to who are involved in fuel reduction refuse to address this question. They simply respond with, you can't change human behavior.
Oh gosh, I hope that's not true. I can think of a few humans right now I'd like to change their behavior on, that's for sure, but one of them's in the White House. I'll send Karen the work we did, my work partner and I, Brent Skaggs. We did a research effort with, oh gosh, slipping my mind right now. Anyway, an environmental, Jane Braxton Little. And what we did was we got the human ignitions data and we characterized it. I mean, they did. It was just spreadsheets with different categories. And, you know, fireworks, arson, campfires, automobiles, on and on. And we got that printed in Scientific American. So I will email it to Karen and she can send it out to you. And it's a study on taking that data and presenting it in a way that people will look at it. And it was printed in Scientific American in 2023, 24, I think. And that gives you, for me, that's where you start the communication conversation. But I had 3 burn pile starts within a mile of my house about a month ago. 3 of them, 3 different people a mile away who ought to know better by now had escapes from burn piles during a pretty wet time of the year. I'm like, ah. So there's a lot of work to do there. You know, like don't pull off on a hot day on dry grass with your hot muffler. You know, there's all these things. Campfires, are they really out, or they're not smoking, but you didn't go in there and feel the embers and really stomp it out and cover it with dirt. So we're talking with folks about if you have to pass a video viewing exam from CAL FIRE to get a burn permit for your burn pile, how about you pass a video exam for how to put a campfire out before you go camping? With a little sidebar at the bottom that the campfire host might come by after you leave, and if they see a fire potential there, they're going to fine you $10,000. I'm just kidding, but how about $1,000? How about $100? You know, it's a stunning level of campfire escapes. So we just, you know, to me, it's like hold up the mirror. Okay, what do we do? And we try to educate people as best we can about how to live here in a very fire-prone landscape.
So from Ron Martin, our Tuolumne Buddy. Should small trees be planted after fires, and should there be a pattern such as small glen, single tree, open space, repeat? Sounds like making a more of a park-like atmosphere, if I
Well,
that correctly.
I think it's the thing we have to factor in to avoid overstocking, not pressing the system because we want some result like a saw log, but thinking more about resilience over time and future warming, but also thinking about habitat and a variety of other things. Like how do we get back the habitat values? I'm at the point so frustrated in this phase of my life when I think about what has happened to our public lands in terms of excessive logging impacts and how here we are again. You know, it's really hard, but I think that photo at the beginning slideshow is just one example of a pattern of heterogeneity. It's not frozen in time. Like we tend to think about landscapes like the photograph we took, like, oh, there's a big, beautiful tree. But we tend not to think about the process that that tree has lived through. And it's important to think about that in terms of not only increased fire potential, but drought intolerance. Another reason why we don't want to stick trees together like they're corn crops. The drought intolerance is huge. Until you've seen 150,000 dead trees, like I witnessed in the Dinky Collaborative, which then burned up 180,000 acres, 380,000 acres. We have a rough time. You know, we are in for a rough time. And I think starting where you guys have talked about, home hardening and defensible space really matters. There's still a ton of people around me that haven't done it. It's law. It's common sense. It's how to live here. But I get, you know, people say to me, well, I don't want to look at my neighbor. Well, okay, but you're willing to risk your house burning down? How bad is that neighbor? You know, there's a lot of psychological things to overcome, but patchiness doesn't have a uniform prescription for it. It's based on the landscape that you're standing in front of. It's based somewhat on the expectation of the natural fire regime, the expectation of this climate mess that we've created and what that might mean in terms of water availability. There's a lot of things.
Okay, and we are at the top of the hour, so I do want to say at this point, because this is usually when we start getting some of our participants dropping off. To all of you who are attending today, we appreciate your presence and your interest and your curiosity. And next month, we're going to have some folks from the John Muir Project to talk about a new initiative they're heading up, designed to help protect, to obtain better protections for public lands. So we'll be sending out more information on that shortly. And with that, we'll forge ahead. And like we just, as usual, our audience is just intelligent and curious, and so we have a long ways to go if we want to try to get to the end of all these questions. But and we may not. So there's that. So okay. So thank you all. Karen, you want to say anything before we go ahead?
I want to thank Craig, and I want to sneak in a question, if it's okay. Craig, are you really saying that we should stop even age management as a way of doing forest management and just do selective logging only?
We should stop even age management? Absolutely. I mean, that even age management has no place in our system. And that to me is what matters, is if we're doing particularly thinning overstocked areas that we haven't tended in 100 years. That is less troubling to me if we're removing the right material. Like there's a commonality around increased shade intolerant white fir in pine stands. This is a story that goes way back, and the theme is there are way more of them than there used to be when we had fire operating the way it ought to be in basically a pine mixed conifer forest. So then we're thinking about removing some of those white fir trees. And that's not a bad idea. But the corollary is, wait a minute, those trees happen to be, particularly when they're older and larger, they happen to unravel quicker, get more decadence, have broken tops, have cavities. And so what we've been saying is we want an unencumbered biologist to look at every one of those larger white fir trees to see if they have habitat value, because that habitat value is not overstocked. The tree might be because of shade intolerance and the lack of fire in the system. But the benefits that tree also can carry are not overabundant. So that look has to happen. So it is complicated, you guys. It's like, the doing the right work and having it not be all of a sudden we have a demand that we have to meet, but instead, the right work travels along with the right fire, with the right recreation, with the right community development limitations, with, more simple, more thoughtful decision making in all aspects. Those things travel together. That is less frightening to me than what we currently have, which is, very much a cropland industrial. Why did we make the decision that California has to provide all the food for the world and all the lumber? Who made that decision?
Okay. So it's always all about money, right? So in trying to follow the money, when there is a wipeout fire, does the timber company receive more either fire insurance coverage or the government to be part of the law? Just want to make sure I read this correctly. Trying to follow the money, when there is a wipeout fire, does the timber company receive more either fire insurance coverage or the government for the part of the loss? And if so, do they want the most trees possible planted, since fire is their backup income and may not be a bottom line loss at all?
I don't know much about the insurance coverage, particularly on the private landowners landscape scale. I think there is certainly there's a claims fund set up now for prescribed burners that are burning within the prescriptions that they meet. And if an accident happens, an escape, they can reach that claim fund that we helped create to cover the harm if they're doing everything right. So when SPI ground catches fire, they're looking to either the federal fire response or the state responsibility area response, or both, depending on how bad it is. And so we pay a lot of money to support a density on private lands. I would argue we pay a lot of money to defend that when it catches fire, and it catches fire more frequently than the public land does. So there is something there that we ought to be talking more about, which is if industrial timberland is burning more frequently at higher intensity, and the feds and the state, the taxpayers, are the ones responsible for putting that fire out. We spend millions and millions and millions and millions, and they benefit from that. That's one way to think about it anyway, is that how to me, the larger question is, how come it's less of a struggle now. There is more money actually getting on the ground to do decent work than there ever has been. But it always has struck me as tragically sad and pathetic and infuriating that as soon as you get a wildfire, the money is endless. You can just write the check, whatever it takes. We'll spend billions to put the fire out and then rebuild the infrastructure and patch up the big mess we've created. We've always got money for that. But we don't have the money. For example, the Forest Service on the roughly 12 million acres of the Sierra Nevada National Forest have never, ever been close to having a restorative burn program with a committed cadre of people that do nothing but restore the land, whether it's meadows or, treating pine plantations so they're less flammable to lighting good beneficial fire. We don't even come close to what we need. And that was a big recommendation on the Wildfire Commission that I participated on for 18 months and over 10,000 collective hours, was expanding beneficial fire and having that unit-based dedicated workforce, the thing we've never had. We got timber sale people crawling all over the place. We got tons of them. We've never had the restorative workforce. We've never taken fire regimes seriously as a metric that we ought to be thinking about.
Yeah, it's we are a reactive culture, not a proactive culture.
Sorry to be depressing, but to me, that's the thing to work for is, to me, I would turn off the timber program, period, for the rest of this century and do nothing but restorative work. Prepping, planting, burning, fixing meadows. There's decades and decades of good work to do that doesn't involve any road building or large tree logging. So and they owe it to us. That to me is a matter of atonement for what's happened in the past.
I just wanted to, I want to appreciate so much the presenter, Craig Thomas, and also I understand it's way more questions, etc. So I was wondering if we could announce a way to reach Craig Thomas with additional questions and reach each other as well as with those questions, because I want to respect that there's many other questions going on right now.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. We actually, that reflects a request in the chat for your email, Craig, if you would be willing to provide that.
Sure.
Sounds like a lot of people are engaged in this conversation and would like to follow up. So you may have a lot of new friends in the near future.
Yeah, I think it would be, if anyone's interested, I felt the same way after this roadless meeting last week, is starting to do more, and not just me yammering away, but we get a diverse group of people and talk about somebody put something in the chat there about a locally generated workforce, that's in the community. Absolutely. And it's interesting that CAL FIRE just closed a workforce development grant period that's got $1 bazillion associated with it. I wrote 2 letters of support, one for the High Sierra RC&D and one for my local Garden Valley Fire Department that is doing something called Fireworks. And they're both interested in building a workforce that does restorative burning in particular, but all forms of restoration. If there's nothing better we could be aiming at than to employ people who live in our own communities permanently to be a restoration workforce that is at the scale that meets the size of the problem.
So, Craig, there's a frenzy of people eager to do prescribed burning and thinning in state and national forests. However, this allows forests to become hotter and drier. I see fires burning rapidly through new grown brush and grass that dries to tinder. How do we deal with this? My town is in Washington State. a lot burned down in 2024 when a fire raced 9 miles in 24 hours through recent burn areas. Do you think this rush to burn and thin is dangerous? What do we do?
Well, I'm personally going to trust the fire regime. And that doesn't mean we have to light everything on fire, but like I own a DR brush mower, and I don't know if you know this, but are you familiar with the plant Scotch broom? It came off a schooner in the gold rush. That was the first report. The second one was in the town I live in. So one of my Scottish ancestors lugged it up here, and it's just unbelievable. And so what we're doing is trying to figure out how many different ways can we manage these landscapes and safely and thoughtfully. And, I do a part of my job is my DR brush mower. And do I like the fact that it burns gasoline? No. But I don't want Scotch broom 6 feet high by the time I blink my eyes. And I'm basically carving off different parts of my property and burning and trying to keep fire in there as much as I can. It's not easy to do. But how do we manage it is a very absolutely important right-on question. It's not simple, and I can't tell you how many years it's taken the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force, the thing I'm a part of, years to put the word maintenance in their grant proposals. So we're taking this boatload of money and we're doing some initial work, and let's just say for the sake of discussion, it's good work. And then we walk away. And I'm going, it grows back. And what I mean by that is not that I don't care about shrubs. I love shrubs. I love wildlife habitat. I love it all. But we can't make everything we love happen on every acre. That's not going to work. We have to make some hard choices. So I do mine with a brush mower, and I mow down Scotch broom, which is an invasive plant, but actually honeybees love it. And, sorry, but we have to make hard choices. We try to make them thoughtfully and compassionately and with our ecological brains and do the best we can do with that kind of work. And hopefully that's where we're heading in terms of the choices we make. No more old growth logging. Fire that's scaled to the need. Being careful when you're burning your burn piles. Do your defensible space. I mean, there's part of me that's actually hopeful. And there is a boatload of money. I just worry that when I hear Wade Crowfoot say, oh, we got to get rid of all this green tape, I go, uh-oh. Green tape is part of our environmental law process. When I hear them say that, I get very unhappy with them. I'm going, we can do planning, and with the money we have, we can do good planning, thoughtful planning. We can do our site surveys. We can do a good restorative work. We don't need to get away from the rules. That's the thing I'm dealing with more than anything else, you guys, right now. We got a wildfire crisis. Let's get rid of the rules. And the spotted owl while we're at it. That's exactly what's happening right now in California. It's infuriating. And I'm seeing a fair number of my conservation partners that are in collaboratives where there's a lot of money on the table to turning a blind eye to that, which makes me sick. It's so tragic to see this, and we've got to push back on that. But that doesn't mean doing nothing.
I think you're singing to the choir on those sentiments. I hope you are.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, yeah, I just have to. On a personal note, we love our battery-powered weed whacker. It's pretty,
So do I.
The Scotch broom I can't pull out in the spring when the ground is moist.
Yep.
We go at it with the battery-powered weed whacker, and
battery-powered battery powered mower, weed whacker, all of it's good, and sometimes it's not enough. But I choose it whenever I can.
Amen. Okay. So is there a model or algorithm that would tell them how and what tree to place in the ICO approach based on landscape characteristics?
Ooh, I won't go on that. Read that 4-pager that's as a part of the email. And it talks about how to think about that patterning. That whole ICO thing, individual trees, clumps, and opening, has been around a long time. Is it a perfect answer if we have 70-mile-an-hour winds blowing? No. Does it give us a better chance at resilience? Yes.
Okay. And in your view, does the focus and funding focus on forest thinning for wildfire resilience give communities a false sense of security? Does it undercut motivation to protect homes?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good question. So I'm looking out my window that the property below me has been recently treated with a mulching masticator, and I'm thinking, God, I couldn't catch fire this year if I wanted to. No, I think it's just part of a bigger picture. And for the Fire Safe Council I belong to is do nothing but hammering away on defensible space and home hardening and finding money to help people do it if they can't do it. And it's a lot of work. And I'm coming up on 80 myself, and it's a lot of work to live out here. But false hope. I don't know. It shouldn't. If they understand the system, but if you do the treatments and you don't have the density of fuels that was, believe me, unnatural. Okay, if we care about nature, then we shouldn't be jumping in and down cheering overstocked high density shrub fields and oak trees that were never represented here ecologically when it was burning at a cycle every 5 to 10 years. The native people lived in this environment. And there's been a history of thousands of years of fire use, not, as a part of the culture of gathering and safe. They had their own safety measures to keep the village safe, to be able to see around. I mean, there was a ton of burning going on. So I try to help people understand what you're looking at. Because it's beautiful doesn't mean it's necessarily right, which is hard. The hard thing for people to, I try not to get pushy about that, but I try, I have a neighbor across the road who refused to sign the right of entry agreement like all the rest of I did my own work, but in our neighborhood, we had a bunch of neighbors that signed the right of entry agreement to have the work done, and a few people that said nope. And I'm going, oh boy. So helping people understand, me too. I'm not saying I had all the answers. I read science every day, trying to stay up on what it says about what the system was that we live in and what it means now with 40 million people running around. It's like trying to play fair about it all is really important. It's not easy. It's easier to go black and white, and nothing is. It's playing, trying to navigate it all is the only thing we can do. And it's not perfect, but I think we're making headway. I think in the last 10 years, CAL FIRE has changed dramatically from the institution they used to be, which was strictly put it out. And that came about because Ken Pimlott, as the chief at the time, opened his door to several of us. And we had some very robust conversations. And he listened. And he was there already himself, but he felt like there was enough support to start thinking more broadly about what CAL FIRE is. And right now that I'm more hopeful about them than I am about the Forest Service and the destruction that's happening to our federal lands.
Yeah. I appreciate your notes of optimism. You're, trying to give people reason to stay in the fight. Okay.
We could all move to New Zealand or Sweden, I guess, but I'm not gonna.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
yeah.
stay here, come hell or high water. I've had 40 feet of flame in my front yard, you guys. I stayed and fought it with one CAL FIRE guy. And the only reason I have a home that I built was that I did the defensible space 35 years ago. I didn't call it that then, but I read enough fire science to know it probably wasn't good to be living on the top of a hill over here with a bunch of brush down there. And so I, survived that. And I show pictures of that fire to folks saying, don't think it won't happen here.
You are a testament to that by being here today. That's a little bit of, prevention is worth the pound of cure.
Craig, one of the areas that you didn't touch upon, and I think is an increasing concern, is the use of backfire. And Chad Hansen and Dominic de la Sala have said that the biscuit fire was between 50 and 66% backfires. I live in Oregon, in the Willamette, and our last fire, the Lookout Fire, was over 50% backfire. Yeah. And the question that we're trying to raise with the H.G. Andrews Experimental Forest is, at what point do backfires become the problem and not the solution?
Very, very good point. I will refer to something very close at home, which was Caples, where a bunch of us environmental folks went up and did a lot of really good work, and we burned 1,000 acres, and then on day 10 it blew up. And only 300 acres burned inside a NEPA footprint that was going to all be burned. So it wasn't some massive tragedy. But as soon as it became a wildfire, they backfired the whole north-facing slope of the Caples Creek drainage. And we lost 23% of the large old growth trees, which kills me. And their comment, they felt they had to do it. And that's, the other thing, Craig, is the rampant use of retardant and the chemical toxicity of retardant. And, we could go on talking here forever, but that's another one. Yeah, backfiring can be reckless. I think part of the problem, Craig, is if you have local resident firefighters, people that live in the community where the fire is, you get a better result than if you got some out-of-towner that doesn't give a damn. And their job is to put it out, and whatever they got to do, they just do that. And it's not their home ground that's burning. I think that is a huge piece of how, if we're going to look at it, we need to look at that too. Well, good to meet you all. I'm willing to carry on with any kind of conversations that you want to have at some later date. I'm happy to offer. I think when the roadless rule comes out, I know the Sierra Clubs, we're at the national coalition level, but I think getting local responses, whether it's from recreation or Trout Unlimited people or people that just care about the natural world and don't want to see any more roads because we've already got 37,000 miles of roads in the Forest Service they can't manage. However you bring your comments together, I hope you guys will respond when it might be out in the next week or two. And they'll probably give us about 3 hours of comment period, knowing what they're doing these days. We'll be lucky if we get 2 weeks. So that's a really important place to dial in if you have the time.
And there was one commenter in the chat who actually suggested you come back. It is, and she rightly points out that you've been generous with your time here. You've shared so many wonderful thoughts with us, so many profound thoughts with us. You've also shared your email. but
Yeah.
an email would be a one-on-one conversation. And so for the entire group to benefit from a specific line of conversation, doing it in a group setting is,
Yeah.
is the way to go. So we hope we haven't worn you out too badly.
Yeah.
It's
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, and the questions were great, and my answers were only marginally sufficient, but it is a deep conversation. So I appreciate your willingness to have that with me, and I'm happy to do it whenever we want to do it. And I'll say this, I'm looking at mostly some elderly people on the screen, and I am feeling like we got to get into recruitment mode, guys, because I don't see the younger generation coming in the way we did with the background. So I'm pushing for getting some funding support to go to UC Berkeley and Davis and do the campus engagement thing about, there is a life over here. You don't have to go to work for an agency or the timber industry. You can move into the conservation movement and figure out how you're going to make a living. But we need young people and a part of it is just the remote thing. I wish we could go out and have beers together afterwards or play that guitar I see in the background that Don has right there. But that distance puts space between us. And I have a lot of younger people constantly saying, will you help us? We don't know what to do. And I'm like, oh my God. I feel deep responsibility for that and being able to pass it on. So one of the most inspiring things I've experienced was when we were doing work up at Caples, we had Generation Green high school students with McLeods, the big heavy duty hose, raking around the boles of the old growth trees. And we'd be able to come by and talk to them about how important that is and how they're putting their shoulder to the wheel to support climate resilience. And when you hike back out there and see those big trees that are still standing when a whole bunch of the understory burned, yeah.
Well, and getting involved with the educational efforts,
Yeah.
when they're real young. And like Dick Kudo from our last month's speaker talked about how he would take kids into recently burned forests,
Yeah.
just try to educate them about the wonders of recently burnt forests and all the magic that's happening in them.
There's a role for everybody.
So thank you everybody for coming. If you can contact me, Karen at KarenMaki.com if you want to work with Stop Clearcutting, which we'd love to have you. So thank you, Craig, for coming. And I think we'll be in touch with you.
I do hope so. Take care.